Jennifer Geddes, and I'd like to welcome you today on behalf of Brown College to the Biennial Trindle Fellow Lecture. Brown College is the oldest residential college here at the University of Virginia, and it's home to approximately 300 students and faculty fellows. And it's situated on Monroe Hill, which is near here, which is the site of the former home of President James Monroe and the oldest building at the University of Virginia. And in case you ever wondered why we talk about the grounds of the university, or you go on grounds, not on campus, that's because the university is built on the grounds of James Monroe's house, the Monroe Hill House. And I'd like to thank Professor Melissa Thomas Hunt, who is the principal of Brown College, for all of her hospitality and allowing Brown College to be the wonderful host of this event. And Chris Oxtacalnis, I'd like to especially thank you for all you've done to make this event possible. And let me move on to another person who made this event possible. In 1986, when the college opened, Professor Carl Trindle became its first director of studies. He subsequently became the principal of Brown College, the only person who has held both roles at Brown College. No other faculty member has been as involved or contributed as much to the life, the development, and flourishing of Brown College. When Professor Trindle stepped down as principal, students, faculty, and friends of Brown College created an endowment in his honor, with the idea that it would be used to bring to the university innovative thinkers and scholars whose work spanned the divide between the sciences and the humanities. And it is my delight to introduce today Professor Trindle, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
When I stand on the stage here, I think of all the distinguished people who have preceded me here, but I'm not going to mention any of their names. I don't want to embarrass them even in absentia, because none of them can compare with our guest for today. I'm standing between you and an hour of great pleasure, so I sympathize with your impatience and your resentment, but I'm going to say a few words nonetheless. My introduction is a reminder of materials you can study at your leisure in this handout. We've all been much enriched by the biography, short fiction, and novels of Rebecca Goldstein, member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and MacArthur awardee. And one thing that's left out is a citation from the MacArthur Award. Rebecca Goldstein is a writer whose novels and short stories dramatize the concerns of philosophy without sacrificing the demands of imaginative storytelling. Her books tell a compelling story as they describe with wit, compassion, and originality the interaction of mind and heart. In her fiction, her characters confront problems of faith, religious faith, and faith in an ability to comprehend the mysteries of the physical world as complementary to moral and emotional states of being. Goldstein's writings emerge as brilliant arguments for the belief that fiction in our time may be the best vehicle for involving readers in questions of morality and existence. Now that citation could be improved, if only it were longer and more breathless. But I won't add to it necessarily, but I'll just tell a few personal asides. But I was looking for a way to understand the context and the life situation of David Bohm, the physicist who provided an alternative view of quantum mechanics and was severely punished for it. There was The Properties of Light by Rebecca Goldstein. And when I wanted to puzzle out something of the situation in which Kurt Gödel discovered his incompleteness theorems, there was incompleteness, and actually pretty complete description of his life and story. When and in the past few years, after those particular gifts, new gifts kept coming. 36 arguments for the existence of God, and most recently, Plato at the Google points. These are invaluable gifts. And I want to say something more about gifts generally. That is, to refer to the great physicist Biennial Trindle. His essay, The Unreasonable Effectiveness in Mathematics and the Physical Sciences, offered no explanation for the phenomenon, according to that this assistance in grasping the behavior of the world must be considered an undeserved gift, for which we should simply be grateful. So, I can bear this obligation to be grateful for the undeserved gifts which have come my way from Rebecca Goldstein, but also from Brown College administration, from the students who have helped me through rereading some of these works, to the alumni and friends who make the practical things possible, and especially the overseer of all arrangements, Jennifer Geddes, and my stalwart supporter of years and helpmate, Barbara Lodi. It's my great pleasure to share all these gifts with you today, and not stand any longer at the gate of this garden of delight.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Trindle. That was a delightful introduction, and I'm very overwhelmed by it. And yeah, I feel very grateful that anything that I've written could have meant something to you. I feel extremely grateful for that. I'm very grateful to Brown College, the Trindle Endowment, for inviting me here. I've had a wonderful time meeting the students of Brown College, and been impressed by them, and so much have enjoyed being with Jennifer Geddes as well. So thank you very, very much. So I never intended to become a novelist. I started out in physics. I then, because I was very, very confused by quantum mechanics, I kept asking my physics professor. I was already accepted to the graduate program I wanted to go to in physics. Kept asking my physics professor, what does it mean, this quantum mechanics? What is it telling us about the nature of reality, which is why I wanted to study physics. And he was of the school of thought that said, shut up and calculate, which I could do. That was, and finally, I was so tenacious, to get me out of his hair, he said, why don't you go talk to the philosophers? They asked this kind of meaningless question. And so I did. I asked around, who should I go speak to? And I was sent to Professor Sidney Morgenbesser at Columbia. And the first time I spoke to him, we may have spoken about 3-4 hours. I went back many times. He never told me to go away and calculate. He told me to come back, and then finally he told me, I think you're a philosopher. I never planned to be a novelist until I found myself writing a novel. And that still, a novel came and announced itself to me. It said, write me. And so I did. The reaction of my philosophical colleagues was not good. And I was doing, especially, I did hardcore philosophy of science, foundations of mathematics, mathematical logic. I didn't do any of that kind of literary French stuff, right? I was hardcore analytic. And I might as well put up a sign on my head saying, do not take me seriously. I've just written a novel. And the novel got some modest attention, popular critical attention, which made it all the more damning. This, and it really was as if by writing or maybe by publishing this novel, my former colleagues seemed to think that any philosophical analytic ability I had been ripped out by its roots. The two things were just incompatible. And that was a very interesting, rather traumatic for me, but in any case, that is how I first got introduced to what is felt to be the deep hostility between philosophy and literature. And this is a hostility that goes very far back. In fact, it goes back all the way to Plato, who, as probably you all know, banished the poets from his beautiful city of reason, from his Kallipolis, right? There were no novelists in ancient Athens. The epic poets were the novelists of his day, but he would have truly hated us contemporary novelists. After he banishes the poets, he says this, quote, "Nonetheless, if poetry has any argument to bring forward that proves it ought to have a place in a well-governed city, we at least would be glad to admit it, for we ourselves are very susceptible to its charms," unquote. And you know that Plato had great literary gifts, probably the best in the canon of Western philosophy. He wrote dialogues, and when he wants to let loose, his narrative and his lyrical gifts know no equal. It is the purest, most beautiful Greek that has come down to us from the ancient world. So he was susceptible to the charms of the literary arts. What I'd like to speak about today a little bit is whether novels, which is the art form that I love, being very susceptible to its charms, can put forth an argument that will grant them some semblance of philosophical justification. Now, this may sound like a very quixotic task to you. I mean, who cares if novels can be philosophically justified? Novels aren't petitioning philosophy for the right to exist. But the philosophical justification of novels is a task that, for me, has always been pressing. I always write, when I'm writing novels, I always write them with Plato's criticisms in mind. I am always trying to answer Plato. I'm sure I would write better novels, certainly more popular novels, did I not have to answer to Plato, but I do. And I think, that there is the ancient conflict that he isolated, that he zeroed in on, I think is a very real one. I think that novels, all of them, are implicated in philosophy. Not just, the novels of Sartre or Dostoevsky or Iris Murdoch or George Eliot or James Joyce, the kinds of novelists that we think of as being philosophical. I think all novels, in some sense, trespass on philosophical domains, and so they can be felt to be philosophically irritating. They trespass both on normative grounds, right, in the way that philosophers use the term normative, meaning anything that has to do with ought, what we ought to do, how we ought to live, what we ought to believe, any kinds of propositions that have the word ought in them are normative in the jargon of philosophy. And also they trespass on what I'll call here metaphysical grounds, big questions about existence. I'm going to really concentrate on the latter, on the kind of metaphysical trespassing that novels do. I'm actually much more comfortable with the normative trespassing. I think that novels perform extremely important normative work. Earlier today, I was fortunate enough to be taken to Monticello, and this was a great experience for me, but the whole time that we were there, I kept thinking about the contradictions of this man. Now, you, of course, live with this, right, being in this university, but everything about Monticello screamed out the Enlightenment, the architecture, the scientific instruments that adorn the statues, everything, that this is a respect for reason and how far reason can take us, which is, of course, the great hope of the Enlightenment. And yet, right, the contradiction that this man who so believed in reason had slaves and treated them quite well. He only whipped them when he absolutely had to. There was a plaque talking about that. And so how far can reason take us? And actually, he knew that it was wrong, and he said emancipation awaits some next generation. Quite self-serving thing to say, right? So after I'm gone. But so reason can take us very, very far. Novels took us farther. Uncle Tom's Cabin, that novel had an electrifying effect on the abolitionist movement. In fact, you can actually follow where it was a huge event, and it was dramatized. It was put on one stage after another, and they actually have some statistics that I've seen there. When Uncle Tom's Cabin played in a particular city, how many people joined the abolitionist movement? So that kind of, oh my goodness, these are people. These, inhabiting the inner life of people who are very, very different from us, and feeling emotionally, not just being told that these are people, but feeling through the strong, sympathetic emotions that are aroused by novels, can do the work that reason can't do morally. And so, it's morally, I think that novels are on very, very strong ground. So what I want to talk about today, that's what I have to say about normativity in the novel. I have a lot more to say, but I really actually want to talk today about questions of ontology. So ontology, of course, from the Greek word ontos, meaning being, having to do with these big questions of existence. And I think that novels also induce emotions that trespass on the grounds of metaphysics. Starting with, there were 7 big metaphysical issues, ontological issues, that I think novels deal with, and that every novel, just by manipulating who we sympathize with, the character identification, trespasses on normative grounds. I think that every novel trespasses on some subset of the following 7 ontological issues, starting with reality. A feel for the world out there, what it's like for starters, whether there is a world out there, and if there is, whether it's encouraging to our human strivings or utterly indifferent to them, or even downright hostile, whether that reality is reliably ordered, coherent, intelligible, patterned in a way that we can grasp by our particular cognitive capacities, or whether it just exceeds us. We can't grasp it, whether it's pitted by unlawful irregularities, so that it's utterly futile for the self to try to figure it out. Every novel gives us a sense about reality in that big sense. And then there's the self. That's the second metaphysical topic that novelists can't help being implicated in. The nature of the self, what constitutes the self's identity over time, what makes a person the person she is, the very substance of character that a novelist has to struggle convincingly to create. And then 2-3, there's the question of human agency, of the scope, whether it's wide or narrow, to non-existent, of a person's freedom to act, pressed by the facts of his own disposition and his situation and his accumulated history. All of that has to be dealt with by a novelist, and a grappling too with the nature of my fourth ontological issue, consciousness, the what is it like to beingness of sentience, the inhereness of a lived life, which it's one of the primary preoccupations of the novel to represent. It's so intimately entwined with what it is to create a character, the rendering of that in here-ness. And you don't have to be a highfalutin James Joyce or Virginia Woolf. Every novelist has to deal somehow with the in-here-ness of character. As every novelist has to deal with my fifth ontological issue, time's passage, the quality of duration, what Henry James, no less, called, quote, the lapse and accumulation of time, which he identified as, quote, the stiffest problem that the novelist has to tackle. And it is. It's I think they're all stiff, right? But it is a very stiff problem, the flow of time. And connected with time's passage, grappling with the reality of the sixth issue that every novelist, not every novelist, but many of us have to deal with, suffering. A topic that impinges on our feel for reality and whether it's such as to offer us any manner of consolation, and also a grappling with the reality of death, of the struggle to get our heads around the one metaphysical topic that not one of us can altogether ignore, the incredulity aroused by the fact that we, the center of our universe, we and those whom we love, are subject to this radical ontological discontinuity called death. These are 7 topics that we certainly think about as philosophers, and that to write a novel, you deal with these things, and you deal with them through emotions. I call them, that this trespassing, that it's to patheticize, from the Greek for feeling. And every novel produces its pathetic morality and its pathetic metaphysics, in the sense of who is worth identifying with, pathetic morality and pathetic metaphysics, what reality is like in these 7 topics. But we already have a field that is expressly designed to deal with philosophical issues, and it's called philosophy. It was more or less invented by Plato in order to deal with questions of a particularly slippery kind. I call them factually insomniac, meaning you can't put them to bed with the facts. We appear to have all the facts we're going to get when it comes to these questions of morality and metaphysics. That's why, unlike scientific questions, they're not empirical. We're not awaiting the discovery of some facts that's going to answer it one way or the other. It seems to be that the trick is to configure the facts that we already have in the right way so that their philosophical import will emerge. That's part of what a philosopher is always trying to do. But these are not only factually insomniac questions, they're also self-situating. And I would argue no matter how technical the philosophical question is, even if it's the kind of question that I love, foundations of mathematics, somehow the self is involved. The situation of our self regarding everything that isn't the self, which covers quite a lot, quite a large swath. They're questions that are trying to get, in the most fundamental sense, our bearings. It's what we're struggling for. We're trying to get our bearings. Where are we? Where are we? What is the nature of this universe that we're in, this reality that we're in? What are we? Are we of the same stuff as the rest of reality or somehow different? What is it that we're supposed to be up to? What are we supposed to care about? What is supposed to matter to us? These normative questions. And then also the question of what's ultimately in store for us. What awaits us? So where are we? What are we? What are we supposed to be doing with whatever it is that we are? And what's in store for us? That's what I call trying to get our bearings. And that's, I think, what philosophy is about, and such questions matter to us. They matter to all of us, not just to professional philosophers. They matter to all of us profoundly, in the same way that those very same selves matter to us profoundly, which means that we're apt to come at these questions at a self-serving slant. We care about these questions, and we want the answers to turn out to be a particular way because it involves ourselves. We would, all of us, I think, like, every last one of us, it to turn out to be the case that the answers to universal moral questions turn out to be distinctly favorable to oneself, right? Offering a sound justification for the moral imperative of one's getting exactly what one wants, right? So how can we achieve clear-headedness here? How can we correct for this slant, this self-serving slant? How can we arrange the facts that we already have in the right way so that the right arrangement will emerge? And actually, I think the very best metaphor for all of this, the self-serving slant and what we have to do, comes from, once again, Plato, right? From his myth of the cave, in which he pictures us as, in the Republic, that each prisoner is chained to her own personal shadow world, which being generated by her own situation in relation to the shadow casting fire, will be an irreducibly personal vision, one which will try to do justice to the unique position she holds in her own private reality, and will try to fortify her against the terror of whatever lies beyond her control, another word for which is reality. In other words, when it comes to these slippery, factually insomniac, self-situation questions, truth is a very hard thing to come by. But it's the truth that we want, that the self desperately wants. It's very desperation exasperating the situation that makes truth so hard to come by. So that was the obstacle that Plato saw himself up against. Or rather, not him per se, not Mr. Plato himself, but philosophy, which was to be nothing less than this lifting of ourselves up out of our typical wishful fantasizing in regard to questions factually insomniac and self-situation. So what we need to do in the face of this challenge is to formulate objective grounds for our belief. Objective is a slippery word. Here's how I'm using it. Meaning by objective here, grounds that are not intrinsically attached to any one particular point of view, one's own little private reality, shaped by one's own particular situation, but are rather grounds that are, at least in principle, accessible to all reason-guided points of view. That's what Plato presents to us, and there's a substantive presupposition slipped into this method, the same presupposition that philosophy shares with science, and which so knits the two of them together, philosophy and science, that science historically only gradually and incrementally separated itself from philosophy, right? And natural philosophy was physics until well into the 19th century when the word science was introduced. The presupposition that's shared here and this notion of objective grounds that both philosophy and science share together is that truth is an equal access good. Philosophical truth, just like scientific truth, is, if it's accessible at all, accessible at least in principle to anyone who submits to the proper methods, leaving behind any considerations that make sense only within particular points of view, touched by particular emotions or messages from heaven or whatever, right? That in the face of truth, we are all equal. It's a kind of epistemic democracy, and actually, historically, this kind of notion of epistemic democracy went along with the notion of a political democracy, see under the Enlightenment. But this notion of objectivity, the non-importance of particular points of view, very much clashes with a novel. Novels don't appeal to these objective grounds. If they did, they wouldn't be novels. Novels work by way of insinuating emotions in us. I mean, ideas as well, but very much emotions, both normatively and the pathetic morality, which I think is an excellent thing, but and also metaphysically, which is what I'm going to what I'm concentrating on here. Where are we? What are we? What's ultimately in store for us? Novels get us to feel answers to these questions. They accomplish that arrangement of the facts that philosophy also seeks. And if they're really great novels, they do it almost irresistibly, right? You can't help but feel the world is the way a great novelist makes you feel. Which is why Plato was particularly eager to get rid of the great artists, right? He lets the hacks hang around in his city of reason. Anyway, I may have very stupidly stumbled on becoming a novelist, but I've now spent several decades experimenting with that form, experimenting with manipulating normative emotions, manipulating what I call ontological emotions, the sense of these metaphysical questions. And it's actually changed my view of philosophy. I think I've always had this idea of philosophy, and that's actually why I was so drawn to literature. But it's become clearer to me now, and I'm actually prepared to defend the view. Maybe before I wasn't prepared to defend the view. I think that novels, in the very effectiveness that they have in patheticizing issues that philosophers seek objective grounds for, is showing us something very important, maybe not about philosophy, but about the psychology of philosophy, right? That there is a psychology of philosophy. Philosophy always wants to usurp the of, right? So for every area you can think of, there's a philosophy of that, philosophy of history, philosophy of religion, philosophy of education, philosophy of math, philosophy of language, philosophy of art. Well, psychology, there's a psychology of philosophy. Philosophers are there any philosophers in the room? Because they tend to get very angry at me when I say this. All right. But I think at the heart of us, and I think novels reveal this, they lie core intuitions that are more expressive of us, of our own individuality, our subjectivity, our character, our entire orientation toward reality than anything else about us. The intuitions that we use in order to try to get our bearings, and that philosophers refine, showing us the implications, the consequences of them, showing us sometimes when they are inconsistent with each other, but can't eliminate. And what I mean by these core intuitions are the last belief, the beliefs you have that you just don't want to give up in the face of recalcitrant experience, in the way that Quine describes it, right, in the web of belief. What is the belief that you would make any other arrangement rather than, because we always can make other arrangements, right? What is the last belief that you would want to give up? You all have them. If I knew you better, I would ask each and every one of you what they are. There's no philosophy to be done, no reconfiguring of the facts in such a way as to get our bearings, unless there are these animating intuitions that vary between us. I think there's much less variability among our moral intuitions. It's just we don't like to carry out the implications of them. I think when it comes to metaphysics, there are vast differences between us that are expressive of our entire character, our orientation. Listen in on two people who have vastly different intuitions, and I'm talking about professional philosophers, even if they're from the same tradition, analytic philosophy, about, say, the hard problem of consciousness. That's the question of how it is that this mass of slimy brain stuff sloshing about in my cranium has an inner life. Why does it feel like something to be this brain. I've already given away one of my metaphysical beliefs. I believe I am this brain. But how comes it to have an inner life, right? How comes it to be conscious? That's called the hard problem of consciousness. And it's very, very hard for someone who's animated by one sort of intuition when it comes to this question to wrap his head around what somebody who has a very different intuition is even saying. There's a tendency to think, what is he, stupid? What, dishonest? What's going on? It's as if when you disagree about these fundamental ontological issues, you're almost inhabiting a different reality, because in fact you are, I think, inhabiting a different reality, or at least a very, very different orientation towards reality. Some of the issues that I think really bring out these different orientations, I'm just going to name a few of them. One is, I think, extremely provocative, and I want you to be thinking this whole time, how do I think about this? What do I feel about this? How do you feel about the whole experience of being mystified? Philosophical problems tend to be the sort that induce a sense of mystification, at least initially. Usually, to understand a philosophical problem, at least initially, is to be flummoxed. For some people, I have noticed, the presence of the mystifying is emotionally inviting, even thrilling. They just thrill to being mystified. They revel in it. And they frame propositions about the world that only increase the sense of mystery. For others, being mystified is a fact of life. They put up with it and frame propositions about the world that help to accommodate themselves to it. For still others, the idea of the mysterious is intolerable, and they frame propositions about the world that deny its very possibility. Another temperamentally sensitive question is whether you think there can be any explanatory holes in the fabric of reality, just what we call brute contingencies, facts that are facts for no other reasons than that they are facts, no explanation. Or does that just seem intolerable to do? Does that seem to make the world an intolerable cheat to our intelligence, leading us gleefully down the garden path of intelligibility, only to deliver a smack against an explanatory brick wall? We can go through the whole history of Western philosophy, starting with Plato, well, actually starting with the pre-Socratics, sorting out various philosophers according to their proto-rational attitudes toward what Leibniz eventually dubbed the principle of sufficient reason. That is, that there is a reason for everything. Intelligibility runs it's not turtles all the way down, it's reasons all the way down. Principle of sufficient reason. But that intuition was long in play before Leibniz named it, very much in play in Plato, not to speak of Spinoza. And speaking of Spinoza, I can never get through a conversation without speaking of Spinoza. What about the attitude towards the limits of human understanding? One might think, like Spinoza, that the fabric of reality is intelligibly complete, but that there's an infinite web of explanations, and this whole web is itself self-explained. That's what he calls Deus sive natura, the thing that can be conceived of either as God or nature. It explains itself. It's explanations all the way down, but you might think, as Spinoza thought, that we, with our own particular finite capacities, human, all too human, can glimpse only a small part of this fabric, that we are. Spinoza tries to argue for his own version of an incompleteness theorem. Or this notion of there being reasons out there in the world that nevertheless escape human reason might strike you as just irritating, like an itch you can't reach. It struck the logical positivists that way. I was philosophically brought up by logical positivists. Hume, on the other hand, seemed to have been amused by unreachable itches. How do you feel about certainty? Is it your holy grail, a source of chagrin when knowledge falls below the highest standard of indubitability? Or does certainty make you feel coerced, caged, as it does many of my students? Is vagueness a sort of comforter you like to snuggle into? Or does it make you feel like you're marching out to do battle with a fluffy pillow? Certainly, people differ in these. Certainly, one's cognitive skills come into play here, right? The particular kinds of talents that you have, skills that make for cognitive pleasures and cognitive pains. But there are other aspects, not just those in our cognitive makeup, that go into the individually variable responses we have to these temperamentally formative proto-rational, before rationality issues, all of them within wincing distance of that most sensitive issue of all, our limitations, both personally and collectively as a species, not only in understanding but in being, our attitude towards what lies beyond our control. That is, if you are of such a temperament as to even allow for there being such a thing as what exceeds your control. In short, it's the whole of the person, that unity of dispositions and experiences of sense and sensibility, the very complexity of individuality that novelists struggle to make real, that's brought into play in forming attitudes towards the self-situating, factually insomniac questions raised by such fundamental metaphysical, ontological topics as the nature of reality, the nature of the self and personal identity, consciousness, free will, time, suffering, death. So I have this way, I don't know, it's probably getting late, and there's something I really want to play for you because it's art. It's not argument, it's art.